Okay, boys and girls, remember when we left off? End of chapter 15. Peter was in the eating hall and had just was talking to the little bird, and then the bird got scared and he realized somebody was behind him or something that yelled, "Hoy!" A voice roared directly behind him. "Who goes there?" So chapter 16, the night patrol. Peter froze. He listened as a pair of razor-sharp claws scraped against the courtyard floor. The master thief had been so focused on getting answers from Pickle Sparrow that he hadn't noticed that the groaning pack of monsters had finally worked its way to the center of the kingdom. Everywhere Peter turned, his ears were met with the miserable clink-clink of dragging chains. The night patrol had found him. "Hey, Longclaw!" the voice roared again. "You better get over here." Peter heard another creature stomping from the opposite side. "What now?" it growled. "I was bringing the chidlers by just now when I heard voices inside. Definitely sounded human." "Human, eh? Must have got trampled at tuck-in, poor things," the second said, snapping what Peter could now tell was some kind of whip against the floor. "What do you say, boss? Think we should tell the king?" "No need for that, Ma. I say we just keep the fun between ourselves." Peter slunk deeper into the shadows, trying to grasp his situation. He could tell they were huge by the way the floor winced with each step. Their whips sounded like they had bits of glass braided into the ends. It also sounded like each of them was carrying some kind of long chain in their free hand. Their voices were deep and fierce, especially that of the bigger one, Longclaw. Peter could hear little splashes of drool falling onto the ground at their feet. "Whoever's in there," Longclaw snarled, "you're in violation of the king's royal curfew. The punishment is death. Yeah, if you beg real pathetic like, we might make it quick. But if you try and escape, we make it real slow and real fun." They broke into wild fits of laughter, snorting and wheezing. The awful sound sent chills along Peter's arms. He couldn't imagine what kind of horrible monsters he was up against, but he was pretty sure they were serious about killing him. He slowed his racing heart as the creatures lumbered through the wrecked eating hall. "Come on now, we ain't got all night." Longclaw swept a pedestal aside with his mighty arm. The stone pillar smashed against the far wall, exploding into 100 pieces. Peter swallowed. If that creature could shatter rock, who knew what it could do to bone? Suddenly, he caught a whiff of musk in the darkness, and his whole body went cold. They were apes. For those of you who have only seen domestic apes, you might not realize how truly horrifying these creatures can be. While they vary slightly from species to species, most wild apes have two terrible, cracked horns sprouting from their brow, which join in a giant tusk right where the nose should be. Their mouths are wide and drooling, filled with ivory fangs that stick out in all directions. Many years before, Peter had happened upon one such monstrosity while robbing the hold of a sea circus. The encounter, which nearly resulted in Peter getting his arm bitten off, still haunted him to this day. Peter crouched in the shadows, listening as the night patrol came closer. He reminded himself that animals in the vanished kingdom were different from those back home, and in the case of these apes, that might mean even more deadly. "Look at this bloody mess!" Longclaw kicked over a platter of liver biscuits. "Place reeks like a hog-sty." "That's humans for you," Maul said, scraping leftover pudding worst off his heel. "Bunch of disgusting creatures." "Watch your gob," Longclaw swiped at his head. "The king's a human, you know. If it weren't for him teaching us to speak with all of his books and charts, we'd all be in a jungle somewheres, flinging dung and sucking ticks off of our rooty humps." He raised the chain in his free paw. "But now we got slaves to do that for us, don't we?" He gave a sharp yank to the chain. From somewhere around the corner came 100 miserable groans and sobs. Slaves? Peter thought to himself. They must be fettered to the other end of those chains. But as pitiful as their cries were, the boy knew he was no good to anyone if those apes got hold of him. His first concern had to be with his own survival. The night patrol was blocking his exit, so running wasn't an option. He could try scaling the wall, but it would be just as dangerous. Apes have predator's eyes and would spot his movements in a second. No, the only thing to do was keep very still and hope they lost interest. "Hold up," Longclaw said, taking a step in Peter's direction. "I think I whiffed something back by the wall. Human, right? Like I said?" Longclaw raised his scourge. "Flank the perimeter. I'll check them shadows." The apes split up and started working along opposite walls of the hall. Peter pressed his body against the pedestal, trying desperately to come up with a plan before they reached him. He felt the black pair of fantastic eyes in his pockets. He didn't much savor turning into a tiny, squishable insect right now, but he was running out of options. If he was lucky, maybe he could crawl away before they spotted him. "Hoy! There it is!" Maul said, spotting Peter's elbow in the shadows. "Something moved over there." They charged ahead, knocking planters and pews out of their path. Peter didn't have a moment to spare. He ripped his bandage off and pressed the two black eyes into his sockets. The next moment, he felt his whole body changing once again. The ground beneath him expanded as he shrank down and down. But something was wrong. His hands weren't just shrinking. They were sprouting feathers. Peter opened his mouth to yell, but all that came out was a high-pitched chirp. The apes kicked Peter's pedestal aside. They stared down at the floor. "You dumb lout," Longclaw said, clobbering Maul upside the head. "It was just one of them tweeting birds." The ape was speaking the truth, for hopping on the ground before them was a tiny, terrified sparrow. "A bird?" Peter thought to himself, flapping his wings. "But how?" The how didn't matter at the moment. He had to get out of there. He quickly learned that being a bird was not nearly so easy as being a beetle. He had no arms or hands. His feet were awkward and long, and his face was covered with feathers. Even worse, Peter couldn't quite seem to manage flapping both wings at the same time. That, combined with the usual blindness, made it pretty much impossible for him to fly more than a few inches, if you could even call it flying. "Hold up! What's she doing on the ground like that?" Maul said, watching as the flapping bird crashed into a table leg for the third time. "Ain't all sparrows supposed to be chained up? King's orders?" Longclaw peered at the other pedestals, noticing the first time that they were each unbirded. "Someone sprung 'em, every last one of 'em." He squatted down in front of Peter. "Maybe this little flapper can tell us what happened. And if she don't, then we'll just have ourselves a midnight snack." He snatched Peter by the tail feathers, dangling him over his mouth. Peter the bird's little heart was beating faster than he thought possible. "Hello, morsel," the ape said with a grin. "Care to tell us what transpired here tonight?" Peter wilted under the beast's hot, putrid breath. The last time he had been this close to an ape, he had nearly lost a limb. Now he was facing the possibility of losing a lot more. Unless he wanted to get eaten, he had to think of an answer fast. Peter knew the best lies were mostly truth. That way you can look as honest as possible when telling them. He began to cry. "Don't eat me, sir. I just want to be put back on my pedestal." All true. Peter didn't want to be eaten, and he very much wanted to be on a pedestal. "Hogwash," Longclaw said. "You tweeters been dreaming of freedom for years. You peck at them pretty little ankle chains so much we got bloody replace them every half moon. Now, who helped you lovelies escape?" "It was a stranger," Peter said, again thinking the truth would be most convincing. "I'd never seen him before." Also true. "He shouted something about 'down with the king,' and then popped our chains off like magic. My sisters flew away, but I couldn't on account of a broken wing." He thrust out a crooked arm as proof. "I saw the stranger run off, though. He went that way." Peter pointed in a direction leading away from Mrs. Molass's house. "A lockpick?" Longclaw put his paw straight through the wall. "King'll have our hides if he hears this." He threw the bird to Maul. "Your chores can wait. Shackle this one and assemble the horde. I want all apes on the lookout for that stranger." He stormed off. Maul carried Peter to an empty and still upright pedestal. He took a tiny gold shackle between the tips of his claws and struggled to latch it around Peter's tiny bird leg. At last he succeeded. "Scrawny rat," the ape muttered. Hardly worth a meat. He took up his whip and lumbered into the corridor. You may remember that both of the apes had entered the eating hall clutching a long chain. As Maul stomped across the floor, his chain pulled tight, dragging 100 slaves with it. The captives stumbled and rattled and moaned their way right past Peter's nose. Who are those wretched souls? He wondered to himself. They were obviously prisoners of some sort, but if that was so, why didn't the king just ship them off to the just deserts? Having only a beak, Peter couldn't quite smell as well as usual, but whatever these creatures were, they stank. I just lost my place. Where am I? Oh, there it is. Okay. They stink like they hadn't bathed once in their lives. He listened as the miserable procession moved past him. Peter was having trouble sorting out their exact numbers. Sparrows, as a species, are not renowned for their attention spans, but thought he counted at least 100 heartbeats along the rusted chain. Move it, you maggots! Maul cracked his whip from somewhere down the hall. The mysterious prisoners staggered forward, their groans echoing through the palace. When the eating hall was finally clear of all danger, Peter set to the challenging task of removing his eyes. While struggling, the great thief wondered about how exactly these particular fantastic eyes worked. Have you guys figured it out? First, they changed him into a bug and then a bird. But remember, the first time he tried, it also tried to turn him into something else, but we just we didn't know what it was doing. You guys remember? He was in the just deserts, and he started getting all changed. Remember how he was changing and he couldn't breathe? So it was that one and the bug and the bird, right? Okay, so Peter thought of the brief conversation he'd had with that beetle on, that sun got bright all of a sudden, on Mrs. Molasses' wall. And just before the apes arrived, he had been talking to a sparrow. Maybe these eyes turned him into whatever animal he had last touched. If that was so, then meeting that peevish beetle had proved more helpful than he originally realized. So what happened the first time he tried these eyes? Peter tried to think back on his journey across the just deserts. What animal could he have touched? He assumed that Sir Toad didn't count, so it had to be something else. He remembered how he couldn't breathe and how everything around him, even the air, had burned like fire against his clammy skin. But what sort of animal can't survive its own habitat? Unless I wasn't in my own habitat, he chirped to himself. Maybe I was turning into something from the ocean, something like a fish. Peter thought of the shipyard back home and how the docks were always covered in suffocating fish. That's exactly how he would have died had not Sir Toad been there to save him. He only hoped he'd have a chance to return the favor. Peter finally managed to remove the black eyes with the help of both feet and a stray relish spoon, and was soon sitting on the pedestal as a full-size 10-year-old boy once more. The tiny gold chain around his ankle had burst wide open upon his transformation. I must remember never to handle a snake, he thought to himself, or else I'll never get these things out. Because he wouldn't have any arms or hands, right, to get the eyes back out. Peter hopped down and raced from the eating hall. He had left the box with the other fantastic eyes behind a pillar in the corridor. He needed to retrieve them before anyone found them. When he reached the gate, he grew pale. He could smell that someone had been near, someone filthy. Peter searched the wall for a release mechanism. If these barriers were truly meant to keep people locked in, then it followed that there might be some way for the night patrol to activate them from the other side. Sure enough, he found a small lever hidden just above his head. Peter pulled it with both hands, and the mighty gate clanked up into the ceiling. As soon as there was enough space, he wiggled under the iron bars and ran to the box of fantastic eyes. The remaining pairs were just as he had left them. Whoever had passed must not have noticed them in the shadows. Breathing a sigh, Peter took the black eyes from his pocket and replaced them in their eggshells. The boy was so focused on the box that he failed to notice something else on the floor. Laid out in the middle of the corridor was a large circle of rope, tied off like a lasso. What do you call that whenever somebody puts a rope out and it looks like a lasso that's connected to a rope and they put it in the middle? Like a lot of times they'll do it in the forest or out in the prairie or fields. The end trailed down the hallway and disappeared through a crack in the wall through which 4 pairs of eyes watched. The spies studied Peter from their hiding place. fidgeting and fussing to get a better view. "What's he doing?" one of them said. "Move your fat head. I can't see," another hissed. "Both of you shut up before he hears us." Peter snapped the box closed. His ears had just caught whispers at the end of the hall. "I know you're watching me," he called out, rising to his feet. "Do it!" a voice shouted. Before Peter could react, a snare pulled tight around his legs, whipping him off his feet. His head struck the ground with a deafening crack, and once again, his body went limp. He's got to quit getting hit in the head, doesn't he? So that thing that's a lasso that was sitting in the middle was connected, right? And so it was a snare, so that it was like a trap, like you would make for an animal that comes along in the woods. And so when Peter stepped in it, they yanked it, and it grabbed a hold of his legs and pulled him up and knocked him on the floor. That's the end of chapter 16. Okay? See you guys.